Great. So in a nutshell, our studio focuses on exploring the backgrounds and origins of materials that are kind of part of our everyday lives. And primarily this has been through the wastes of industrial production, especially from mining. So we sit kind of at an intersection between design, art, and science. So in the context of this forum, I can draw attention to some of the aspects of materiality and color because many of these wastes are perceived as hazardous, and often this is because of the state. It's usually this muddy, wet, liquid, or even dusty material. So part of our challenge as a design studio is actually trying to transform it from this kind of wet sludge into something solid, or from a dust into something like a stone. And then obviously a lot of these wastes are very colorful. And sometimes color is associated to nice natural beauty, but when it gets past a certain point of saturation and contrast with the surrounding environment, it becomes unnatural, synthetic, and in our case, dangerous. So these are different minings from around, some from Australia, Germany, and even Poland. So the first project, and you guys are still with me, right? You see a photo of ceramic tableware here? Cool, good. So the first project that I'll talk about really exemplifies this. This was a project we started during our master's at the RCA, and we made this ceramic tableware from red mud. Red mud is a waste of the aluminium industry. So I'll give you a bit of a background on that. So aluminium is not mined as a metal, just like this. It actually comes from this, which is bauxite ore. This stuff is mined around the world in Guinea, China, Brazil, Australia. And eventually they extract this colorless white powder. But in this process, you have to wonder where all the colorful stuff went. So this is them smelting the white powder into the metal. And the red stuff that's left behind is this. And this is called bauxite residue, or just commonly red mud. It's very caustic. It's very messy. It stains absolutely everything. We even did some tests with a pigment company, and you can actually use it as a pigment in plastics and inks, but it's also classified as hazardous, which limits its reuse. So for every part of aluminium metal you see in the world around you, you can imagine that there's 2.5 parts of red mud sitting somewhere in a waste site, which adds up to about 150 million tons per year of this stuff. So in the center is the factory, and this waste site is in Australia, and it's quite common. Size is about 7 kilometers across and sometimes 30 to 50 meters deep, full of red mud. There's even some in Germany. This is not too far away from you guys, I think near Hamburg. So these waste sites do have this sort of dark beauty to them, something kind of, I don't know, mysterious, but also a bit scary. But there's obviously serious environmental implications. When things go wrong, they go very wrong. So this is in 2010 in Hungary. And this kind of fear is growing with climate change because the weather patterns are changing. So our ability to predict how a waste site might behave is changing. But what actually drew us initially to this space was not so much the environmental aspect, but was actually this tension between the scale of this problem. It's a very big problem. It's invisible. Most people don't know about it. And it's also very relevant because aluminium is a metal that's becoming kind of the metal of the future. We were not the first to think about using this material at all. So the inventor of the process of actually extracting the bauxite, the alumina from the bauxite is Joseph Bayer. And he even noted in the first patents that there was potentially uses of the red mud that was left behind. And since then, there's been decades of scientists who have figured out different ways, but nothing has really grabbed. And this kind of falls down to this idea of the brick. People always ask us, why aren't you making just bricks? That would solve the problem. But actually, it's much more complex. There's a lot of limiting factors to this problem. So one of them is economics. You're competing with things that just aren't worth very much. There's a lot of legislation, things that stop it from being used because it's hazardous. And then the most important, at least with regards to what we do, is the public perception. So people are just not willing to have wastes around them used in their world, even if science says it's safe. So the question for us was really then, what is our role as designers? Not really scientists, not really architects or construction workers, but just simply designers. What is our role in this? And for us, it was really about asking new questions. Can, this waste be useful? Can it be sustainable? Can these colors that are initially kind of scary, can we make them into something beautiful and part of the everyday? That's sort of the advantage of what design can do, and it can bring a new sort of value. What the scientists call valorization, we can bring in a value of emotions, aesthetics, intellectual value, and they're quite complementing approaches. So instead of bricks, we made ceramic tableware. Now for us, why ceramics? For us, it was about kind of giving this contrast to the brute nature of industry, the kind of brutality of it, giving something that's quite, that has finesse and fragility, and transforming something from a wet mud into something solid. But really the point was to actually provoke people and to ask questions rather than just giving answers. So if science did show you that these things are safe to use, would you eat or drink from this, knowing that it's an industrial waste? And it's also about challenging this desire for pure and clean virgin materials, because in the future, we're going to have to get used to using secondary materials more and more. And importantly, it was really about telling a new story as opposed to just solving some problem and giving a bit more of an optimistic view. So since then, we've continued working with red mud regularly and exploring different color possibilities, often through glazing. So this is an optical blue. And while the red mud project was really about challenging the perception around a material, this next project I'll talk about is more about showing the function and also the value of collaboration with scientists. So this one was looking at wastes of the copper industry. So copper is the oldest metal we've ever mined. We've been mining it for about 10,000 years, and it's fully recyclable. So actually 80% of all copper ever mined is still being circulated around us. And it's very relevant. It's everywhere. We just don't see it. All of the wires under our feet and in our walls, in our devices, it's very important for our electric future. But the problem is that as the demand is growing, the quality of the stones that we're mining is actually decreasing. And so we're having to dig up entire mountains just to get a few wires. And in the process of growing demand and decreasing quality of stone, we have more wastes. So one of these wastes is slag. I don't know the German word, but there's surely a technical term for it. But basically, it's the molten impurities from smelting and refining and making metals. You get it in almost any metal production. But copper is definitely one of them, and it's been around for a long time. So these are in sort of industrial landscapes of Cornwall. You'll see slag heaps everywhere. You'll see them in Germany, such as this one. Some of this is actually this photo taken from a hiking website in Germany, which is interesting. And some of the old slag heaps have been transformed into cultural centers, which is also quite an interesting reuse case. But it's also part of recycling. So even though we recycle a lot of our copper in Europe, about half of our copper is from recycling. When you recycle, you still produce slag. It doesn't matter if it's from a mine or recycling. So this is a recycling heap in Belgium. And you can see the two different, this is a recycling slag on the left and a sort of more old industrial era slag on the right. But the interesting thing about slag is that because it's been through such high heat, you can use it as an alternative to cement. So it's called a geopolymer, and these are scientists that figured this out in the last few decades, basically. It has about 80% lower carbon footprint. So we were invited to work with an industrial partner, a copper recycler in Belgium, and researchers from KU Leuven in Belgium as a sort of designer residency with a scientific lab to explore their research from the perspective of a maker. And so it was really about learning from their research, taking small tests from a lab and putting them out into the real world through objects. And each of these pieces, I won't go into each of them individually because there's not that much time, but basically each piece was based off one part of their research. So we would take one aspect of their research, whether it's about strength or the flow of the material or the particle size, and we would figure out ways to kind of exemplify that through design. So different sorts of pieces. This was a kind of an unusual one. Basically, the point in this collaboration, what we realized is that designers have a bit more freedom to experiment and to change how we communicate through making and through objects, which allow us to do things that maybe don't have a very practical sense in terms of science, but also sort of bring to light new paths and new possibilities. So this is just one. This was really looking at the strength of the material, so trying to make something quite thin, and also sort of 3D printing in the center. But yeah, different pieces that kind of show the value of this collaboration and playing off each other's strengths. And at the end of it, we held an exhibition in the actual factory, the copper factory, for the factory workers, invited construction industry people, architects, scientists, to kind of explore these pieces. And on the outsides of the exhibit, you had the different elements of the different papers that they were based off, the different research papers. And the idea was to spark conversation and get people to actually see these things and wonder, you know, if you could make this, could I also make a building, or could I also make a road, or could I make bricks? So challenging how we actually experiment with communication. And since then, we've actually returned to some of the techniques we learned from that residency and older techniques of copper working to kind of celebrate the material slag for what it is, but also try to talk about slag as part of the same story as copper. So reconnecting our understanding of the waste with the original metal and trying to fuse them together. So we've made some newer collection pieces like this, and trying to showcase that the reason why the title of the project is This is Copper is we're trying to point out that these wastes, these materials are part of the same story as copper. Different pieces. And we've also been trying to bring color back into the picture. So we've developed a process to actually fuse colored glass directly to these these slag concrete bodies, which is not possible with any regular concrete. Really is unique to slag. And so we've been developing this slowly, sort of a work in progress, but finding ways at a very low energy to kind of create any kind of color we want on a concrete body. So it's different from ceramics, but those are just details. Okay, so I have a bit of time, I'm okay. So some questions to consider. These are just things that we sort of mull over. Is kind of the elephant in the room is what exactly is waste? There's this author, Brian Thill, he wrote this book called Waste Object Lesson. And he says waste is every object plus time. But that's a very object-oriented thought process and very functional thought process, because indeed an object does not survive time. It eventually will fall apart. But if we look through things with the material lens, materials actually never waste. They just change form. So instead of a vase breaking, we can think of it as, you know, a form of terracotta. The terracotta will remain terracotta even after the vase is broken. And it's how we see them that decides if it's considered waste. So a good example is in Boron, California. This is an old mine in California that was full of waste. They had finished mining the boron there, or the borax, and they left all this waste behind. But they recently found that it's now the largest single deposit of lithium. And so this waste site is now the largest lithium mine in North America. So suddenly what was considered waste is now considered what they call green gold because of the lithium that they use to make batteries. And another good example, a bit more contentious, is fluoride. Fluoride was an agricultural waste of the 1950s, and they needed to find some way to use it. And it turns out that it did really miraculous things for people's teeth. And so now this once agricultural waste is now in your toothpaste, in a lot of your water, and it's one of the sort of great dental miracles of the 20th century. A more broad question is the difference between a mine and a quarry. These are English terms, but basically when we say quarry, people think of natural stones, and sort of this brings to mind this beautiful pastoral creations and these kind of vernacular architecture, and it's not so destructive. When we say a mine, people think of disaster, chemicals, and the Anthropocene. And more broadly, why do we scrutinize things that are touched by humans more than the natural ones? So another example is that with red mud, one of the biggest challenges that faces in terms of its public image is people say it's radioactive. But if you actually test a lot of the red mud, it's actually not that radioactive. And in fact, it's scrutinized and it has to go through a lot of these regulatory standards because it's a waste of performance, composition, hazardous properties, transport, etc. that materials like granite do not. So granite is just a natural stone, but is actually radioactive, and people don't really care about that because it's natural. So there's kind of this interesting nuance between natural and synthetic that we just can't seem to get past, but we will have to get past in the future. And then the last question is, this is with an example, is are there limits to aestheticizing something that's unwanted, which is kind of what we're doing. And this example is in the south of France. This is a red mud site. It's been there since the 1950s, out in the open, right next to the train station, the TGV station. And they basically are refusing to remediate it because the people believe that that this site has become part of the sort of natural, patrimonial heritage there. It's sort of a site that they want to keep because it sort of has this iconic status. And it's an interesting example where sometimes when you aestheticize or make something desirable, it also limits and it creates a sort of complacency and limits any changes that happen. So that's just a sort of caveat for designers such as ourselves who are bringing aesthetics to the unwanted. And that's it. Please, I know it's a quick presentation. I hope it was easy to follow. But if you have any questions, do not hesitate to reach out by email or Instagram, whatever you prefer. Yeah, I'll stop sharing this now.